I gifted my daughter a house worth $800,000 fully paid off and believing she would cherish it forever, but her husband repaid my kindness by making me sleep in a freezing garage on a cot he found in a dumpster. He thought I was just a helpless old woman with nowhere else to go. He thought he had broken me. But he forgot one thing. Before I was Grandma Bea, I was the City Planning Commissioner of Atlanta for 30 years, and I know exactly which permits he does not have. I lay there shivering in the dark, waiting for the sun to rise, because when it does, I'm going to make one phone call that will turn his life into dust. Before I tell you how I reclaimed my dignity and my property, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and subscribe to the Never Too Old channel. We are building a community of survivors who know that respect is not negotiable. The pain in my lower abdomen was sharp, twisting like a wet rag. I tried to hold it, I really did, but at 70 years old, the body does not always listen to pride. I looked at the orange plastic bucket in the corner, the one Gavin had tossed in there, with a smirk saying it was for emergencies. This was my life now. Beatrice Washington, who had once sat at the head of the zoning board table, deciding the fate of downtown skyscrapers, was now pulling up her nightgown to squat over a Home Depot bucket in a freezing garage. The humiliation burned hotter than the cold air biting my exposed skin. I closed my eyes tight, trying to block out the smell, trying to pretend I was anywhere else. It was not supposed to end like this. As I sat shivering on the edge of the cot afterward, my mind drifted back to that dinner 6 months ago. The dining room table was set with my best china, the gold-rimmed plates I only used for Christmas. The chandelier I had bought with my first big bonus check was sparkling overhead. Gavin poured me a glass of expensive red wine, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Mom," he had said, his voice dripping with honey like a Southern preacher, "you have taken care of everyone your whole life. Let us take care of you now." Nia sat across from me, nodding, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "We want to build you a suite downstairs, Mama. A real mother-in-law suite with a walk-in tub and a garden view so you never have to worry about stairs again. We just need the deed in our name to secure the construction loan because the bank has strict rules about equity." I looked at them, my family. I saw my daughter, who I had carried and raised, and I saw the husband she chose. I wanted to believe them. I signed the papers right there on the table between the roast chicken and the green beans. I signed away my security for a promise that turned out to be a prison sentence. The sound of the garage door motor grinding to life snapped me back to the freezing present. Sunlight flooded in, blinding me. I scrambled to cover the bucket with a piece of cardboard, my heart hammering against my ribs. Gavin stood in the driveway, dressed in a crisp suit, ready for work, holding a travel mug of coffee. He took one step inside and immediately wrinkled his nose, stepping back as if he had walked into a sewer. "God, Beatrice!" he sneered, waving his hand in front of his face. "You really are losing it, Arn. Not you. You smell like an animal." He reached into a paper bag he was holding and tossed something at me. It hit the dirty floor near my cot with a thud, a hard, stale bagel likely left over from yesterday. "Eat that quickly and get rid of that bucket," he commanded, checking his expensive watch, "and scrub this place down with bleach. I have investors coming tonight, and I do not want them smelling my charity case." He hit the button on the wall and walked away without looking back as the heavy door slid down, plunging me back into the dark with the stale bread and my shame. I waited until the aggressive roar of Gavin's Range Rover faded down the street before I dared to step out of the garage. It was 10 in the morning, but my bones felt like they were made of ice. I used the side door that opened into the garden, my sanctuary, for 40 years. The hydrangeas were wilting, their heads drooping low because Gavin had cut off the irrigation system to save money on water bills while he washed his precious car twice a week. I saw Nia sitting on the back patio. She was scrolling through her phone, drinking a green smoothie, wearing a cashmere cardigan I had bought her for her birthday. She looked up when my shadow fell across the table and jumped so hard she nearly spilled her drink. She looked at me like I was a ghost haunting her sunny morning. My hair was uncombed. My clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in them, and dark circles bruised the skin under my eyes. "Mama," she whispered, looking toward the driveway nervously, as if Gavin might teleport back to catch us. "You should not be out here. Gavin said you need to stay in the annex until the renovations start." "I do not care what Gavin said." I rasped, my voice thick from lack of use and the damp air. I walked closer to her, my steps slow and painful. I pulled up the sleeve of my nightgown, exposing the deep purple and yellow bruise that bloomed across my elbow and hip from where the canvas cot had collapsed under me 2 nights ago, dumping me onto the unforgiving concrete. "Look at this, Nia," I said, holding my arm out. "Look at what you are doing to me. I am 70 years old, sleeping on cement." Nia flinched and covered her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh, Mama, I am so sorry." "Then let me back in," I begged, my dignity cracking. "Give me my room back, or even the basement sofa. Anywhere but there." Nia stood up, but instead of coming to hug me, she backed away until her spine hit the patio door. "I cannot. Gavin says we need to make sacrifices." He sat me down and explained the numbers, Mama. "He says you are dead weight on our financial future right now." The words hit me harder than the cold. Dead weight. I gave you an $800,000 home for free, Nia. I paid for your college. I paid for your wedding. How am I dead weight? It is about liquid assets, Mama, she shouted, her voice shrill, parroting words I knew she did not understand. "We are house rich, but cash poor. Gavin needs the interior space for his business operations to generate capital. He says if you really loved us and wanted us to succeed, you would not mind a little discomfort." A little discomfort? I pointed a shaking finger at the garage. "I am freezing, Nia. My arthritis is flaring so badly I cannot close my hands. If you will not let me in, at least give me a blanket. A real one." Nia ran into the house. For a fleeting second, I thought she was going to grab a key or invite me inside. She came back out holding a bundle of gray fabric. "Here," she said, shoving it into my chest. "Take this. It is wool. It is warm." I looked down at the bundle in my arms. It was heavy and scratchy. The smell hit me instantly, the scent of wet fur and old dust. It was the old blanket we used for Buster, our German shepherd, who died 5 years ago. I could see clumps of his white hair still matted into the fibers. "You want me to sleep with the dog blanket?" I asked, looking her in the eye. "It is high-quality wool. Mama, stop being so difficult." Nia cried, tears streaming down her face now. "Gavin is doing big things. He is going to make us millions. Just hold on a little longer, please." She turned and ran back inside, locking the patio door behind her. I stood there alone in the dying garden, holding a dead dog's dirty blanket. I looked at the glass door at my daughter, turning her back on me. In that moment, the grief vanished. My daughter was gone. The woman inside was just a puppet, and Gavin held the strings. My heart did not break, it turned into stone. If they wanted to treat me like an animal, fine. But they forgot that Buster was a guard dog, and when he was cornered, he bit. 2 days later, the mailman walked up the driveway looking confused because Gavin had ripped out the vintage iron mailbox to modernize the curb appeal and never replaced it. He dropped a stack of envelopes on the concrete near the garage door where I was sitting. I walked over and picked them up. Most were addressed to Gavin Miller or my daughter, but one was addressed to me, Beatrice Washington. It was the electric bill. Since the utility account had not been transferred yet, it was still legally my responsibility. I tore open the envelope, expecting the usual amount. My eyes widened. $842.50. My average bill for this house, even in the peak of an Atlanta summer with the air conditioning running full blast, was never more than $150. Just then, the garage door rumbled open. Gavin pulled his Range Rover in, narrowly missing my cot. He saw me holding the bill, and his face twisted. He jumped out and snatched it from my hand. "Give me that," he snapped. "Stop snooping through my mail, Beatrice." "It is addressed to me, Gavin," I said, my voice trembling with indignation. "And why is the bill over $800? Gavin laughed, a cruel barking sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "That is you, Beatrice. That little space heater you tried to plug in, those things suck power like crazy. You are costing us a fortune. That is why I cut the power to the wall outlets in here. You obviously cannot be trusted with electricity." He stormed into the house, crumpling the bill in his fist. You will be paying that out of your Social Security check, by the way." I stood there in the silence, fuming. He thought I was a senile old woman who did not understand how the world worked. But I was a city planning commissioner. I knew infrastructure. I knew load-bearing calculations, and I certainly knew electrical codes. A 1,500-watt space heater running 24 hours a day would cost maybe $50 a month, not $800. He was lying. I waited until I heard the water running in the master bathroom upstairs. I went to the breaker box located in the dark corner of the garage behind a stack of old tires. I opened the gray metal panel. I traced the circuits with my finger. Everything looked normal until I got to circuit 4. It was labeled garage storage in Gavin messy handwriting, but it was fitted with a massive double-pole 50-amp breaker, the kind you use for an industrial oven or a commercial welder. I followed the metal conduit pipe running from the breaker box. It did not go to the wall outlets. It ran up along the ceiling beams hidden in the shadows and dropped down behind a heavy canvas tarp in the back corner of the garage, the area Gavin had declared off-limits because of hazardous chemicals. I walked over to the tarp. I could feel waves of dry heat radiating from behind it. A low humming drone sound like a swarm of angry bees was vibrating the air. I pulled back the canvas. It was not chemicals. It was a rack of industrial metal shelves. On the shelves were 12 black boxes with spinning fans and blinking blue lights. They were hot to the touch, screaming with activity. Computers. Not normal computers. High-powered processors connected by thick black cables. I recognized what it was from a news report I saw on CNN. Crypto mining. Gavin was not a real estate investor. He was mining Bitcoin. He was using my house electricity running up an $800 bill in my name to generate digital currency for his secret wallet. He cut the power to my heater not to save money, but so I would not trip the breaker for his machines. He was freezing me to death to farm imaginary money. I let the tarp fall back into place. I did not scream. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my old flip phone. I opened the camera. Click. The evidence gathering had begun. The air inside the room was heavy and suffocating like a thick wool blanket wrapped tight around the throat. It was the middle of the night, yet the small, confined space felt hotter than a desert at noon. The relentless hum of the mining rig filled every corner, a mechanical drone that vibrated in Bee's bones. Suddenly, a sharp popping sound shattered the monotony. A spark jumped from an overloaded power strip, followed instantly by the acrid chemical smell of burning plastic. Thin wisps of gray smoke began to curl upward from the overheating machines. Bea coughed as the fumes hit her lungs, but in that moment of danger, a desperate idea formed in her mind. She needed to know the truth. She needed to test the limits of her son's heart, if he still had one. She let her body slide down the rough wall, hitting the floor with a heavy thud. She curled onto her side, clutching her chest with both hands. She forced her breathing to become ragged and shallow, loud enough to be heard through the thin wood of the door. She pounded her fist against the frame. "Gavin." She gasped out, her voice trembling with feigned agony. "Help me! My heart! Please, son, help me!" She waited. For a terrifying second, she thought he might not come at all. Then she heard the heavy footsteps approaching. The lock tumbled and the door swung open. Bea looked up through half-closed eyes, waiting for the look of panic on his face, waiting for him to drop to his knees and check her pulse. But Gavin did not look at her. He stormed into the room, his eyes wide with fear, but his gaze was fixed entirely on the metal racks. He rushed past his mother's prone body, stepping over her legs as if she were nothing more than a discarded pile of trash. He went straight to the source of the smoke. He frantically checked the cables, unplugging the sparking wire and feeling the graphics cards to check their temperature. He was sweating, muttering curses under his breath, terrified that his precious income source might be damaged. Only after the red lights on the server turned green did he finally acknowledge the woman on the floor. He stood over her, his shadow stretching long across the room. Bea reached a shaking hand toward him, her eyes pleading. "Call 911, she whispered. "Please." Gavin looked down at her with a chilling expression of annoyance. He did not reach for his phone. Instead, he glanced around the cluttered desk and grabbed a crumpled blister pack of pills that had been sitting in the dust for months. He tossed it carelessly onto her chest. "Stop acting." He sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Take those and shut up. Even if they are expired, it does not matter. If you die, it is actually better for me. It saves space, and I won't have to waste electricity on your fan." The words hit Bea harder than any physical blow. She froze, watching him turn his back on her. He stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut with a final decisive slam. The lock clicked, sealing her in once again. Bea lay there in the silence, broken only by the whirring of the fans. Slowly, she stopped gasping. She sat up and looked at the cheap medication in her hand. Her heart was pounding, but not from a medical attack. It was pounding with a cold, realized fury. The test was over. The son she once loved was gone, replaced by a monster. She gripped the pills tightly in her fist until her knuckles turned white. She would not die here. Not like this. She would survive this heat and this cruelty just long enough to see him behind bars where he belonged. The morning did not break with the gentle light of the sun, but with a violent roar that shook the very foundations of the house. The vibration rattled the loose floorboards and sent dust dancing in the stale air of Bea's confined room. It sounded like the earth itself was being torn apart. Bea, startled from her fitful sleep, dragged her aching body toward the small window. She wiped the grime from the glass and peered out into the yard. What she saw made her blood run cold. Parked right in the middle of the overgrown lawn where her father had once planted the great oak tree, sat a massive yellow bulldozer. Its engine was idling with a deep mechanical growl that drowned out the birds and the wind. The smell of diesel fuel wafted up, mixing with the morning air. It looked like a predator waiting to strike a hulking beast of metal and grease, sitting on the sacred soil of the Washington family estate. Standing near the front tracks of the machine was Gavin. He looked different today. He was not wearing his usual loungewear or the stained shirts he wore while gaming. He was dressed in a crisp shirt, pointing authoritatively at the ground while talking to two men in orange safety vests and hard hats. He looked energized. He looked like a man who finally had the world in his hands. In his grip was a large, rolled-out blueprint flapping in the breeze. As he turned to point at the west wing of the house, the angle allowed Bea to see the bold lettering stamped across the top of the paper: Townhouse Project Phase 1. The realization hit Bea harder than the heat of the mining rig. He was not planning to repair the roof. He was not fixing the porch. He was going to flatten it all. This house had sheltered 3 generations of the Washington bloodline. It held the laughter of her childhood, the memories of her late husband, and the secrets of the family history. Gavin was going to scrape it all away. He was going to demolish the legacy that his grandfather built with his bare hands just to subdivide the land into tiny plots and sell them for quick cash. He was selling their soul for a payout. Bea watched as he laughed, shaking hands with the foreman. He gestured widely, miming the action of the bulldozer crushing the front porch. He had no respect for the past and no care for the future. He saw this land only as a bank account to be liquidated. But as she watched his arrogant display, a sudden thought cut through her despair like a knife. Her eyes narrowed as she looked past the bulldozer to the dense line of trees marking the property edge. A cold calm settled over her, replacing the panic. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass and whispered to herself, "He does not know." Gavin had never paid attention to the town council meetings. He never read the deed to the house. He had no idea that this specific plot of land, the historic Washington estate, sat directly inside the newly designated Red Conservation Zone. The trees he was planning to uproot were protected. The soil he wanted to churn up was classified as a heritage site. By bringing that bulldozer onto the property and by signing that contract with the developers, Gavin had not just made a business deal. He had committed a federal offense. He thought he was burying the past, but he had just dug his own grave. Bea stepped back from the window, a faint smile touching her lips for the first time in weeks. He had just handed her the weapon she needed to destroy him. The expensive sports car roared down the driveway, carrying Gavin and Nia away to celebrate their ill-gotten victory. Their laughter echoed in the humid air, a cruel sound that mocked the gravity of what they were planning. They were going to a fancy steakhouse to toast the destruction of the Washington legacy. Bea waited until the red taillights disappeared around the bend and the rumble of the engine faded into the heavy silence of the afternoon. This was her chance. She slipped out of her prison of a room, moving with a quiet determination that defied her age. She did not go to the front door, which she knew Gavin had changed the locks on months ago. Instead, she crept around the side of the house to where the old stone foundation met the earth. Her hands trembling slightly with adrenaline brushed away the dirt from a loose brick near the corner. It was a secret her husband had taught her 40 years ago, a fail-safe for emergencies that Gavin was too self-absorbed to ever notice. Her fingers found the cool metal of the spare brass key. It was tarnished, but it still fit. The back door creaked open, and Bea stepped into the main house for the first time in a year. The air inside was stale and smelled of neglect. She expected to feel comfort, but instead she felt a sharp physical pain in her chest. The grand hallway was unrecognizable. The beautiful mahogany console table that her grandfather had carved was gone, leaving only a pale rectangle on the dusty floor where it had stood for decades. The living room was barren. Every piece of value, every antique lamp and hand-woven rug had been sold off. It was as if a swarm of locusts had stripped the flesh from the bones of her home. She walked slowly to the mantel above the cold fireplace. There sat the framed portrait of her late husband, the man who had built this life for them. But the picture was not facing the room. It had been turned around, face pressed against the rough stone of the wall. Gavin could not even look his father in the eyes while he stripped the house bare. Bea reached out and turned the frame over, wiping a smudge of dust from the glass with her thumb. Tears pricked her eyes as she looked at his kind smile. "They have erased us," she whispered to the empty room. "They have sold our history for pocket change." Suddenly the gravel in the driveway crunched loud and sharp. The sound froze the blood in her veins. She heard the distinct, aggressive rev of Gavin's car returning. He must have forgotten his wallet or his phone. There was no time to run back to the side door. The front lock tumbled, and the heavy door swung open. Panic seized her legs. She scrambled toward the only hiding place left, the large walk-in closet in what used to be her master bedroom. She pulled the louvered door shut just as heavy footsteps entered the hallway. She pressed her hand over her mouth, trying to silence her jagged breathing. In the dark, surrounded by the smell of cedar and old memories, Bea listened to her son cursing in the next room, while her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The roar of the engine finally faded into the distance, leaving the house wrapped in a heavy blanket of silence once again. Bea waited a full 2 minutes, counting every second in the dark cedar closet, before she dared to push the louvered doors open. Her legs were stiff, and her heart was still racing from the close call, but she did not have time to recover. Gavin had come back for his wallet, which meant he was distracted and careless. He had likely left the study door unlocked. She moved quickly through the hallway, her bare feet making no sound on the hardwood floors. She slipped into the room that had once been her husband's sanctuary of order and business. Now it was the office of a sloth. The air smelled of stale pizza and energy drinks. Multiple computer monitors hummed in sleep mode, and tangles of wires snaked across the floor like black vipers. But Bea was not interested in the technology. Her eyes locked onto the large leather-bound portfolio sitting in the center of the chaotic desk. The label on the spine read, "Townhouse Project, Phase 1. She opened the heavy cover and smoothed out the architectural plans. Gavin likely thought his mother was just a senile old woman who knew nothing of business, but he had forgotten who she was. She had sat by her husband's side for 40 years as he built his company. She knew how to read a blueprint better than Gavin knew how to read a comic book. Her eyes sharpened as she scanned the white lines and measurements. It took her less than a minute to find the first lie. She traced the property line with a trembling finger. Violation 1. The density ratio was completely illegal. He was trying to squeeze 12 units onto a plot of land zoned for a maximum of 4. The city council would never approve this overcrowding. She moved her finger to the elevation chart. Violation 2. The plans called for 3-story structures with roof decks, but this neighborhood had a strict 2-story height limit to preserve the historic skyline. She flipped the page, her disgust growing with every detail. Violation 3. The setback distance from the main road was listed as 10 feet. The legal requirement for safety and visibility was 25 feet. He was building practically on top of the street. Violation 4 was even more reckless. The drainage plan was non-existent. He was routing the sewage lines directly through the root systems of the protected heritage oaks she had seen earlier. And finally, Violation 5, the most damning of all. The entire eastern cluster of townhouses was situated on unstable soil that was designated as a floodplain. A dark realization settled over her. Gavin was not just incompetent, he was a fraud. He was selling these units off plan, taking deposits from investors for houses that could never legally be built. He was selling a fantasy. This was not a development project. It was a Ponzi scheme designed to steal money before the first brick was laid. Bea reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out her old smartphone, which she had kept hidden and charged for emergencies. Her hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, righteous anger. She hovered the camera over the documents. Click. She captured the density chart. Click. She captured the illegal height elevations. Click. She photographed the fraudulent drainage plans. She took picture after picture, gathering the undeniable proof of his deception. This binder was not just a plan for a house, it was the key to his destruction, and she had every single page stored safely in her hand. The blueprints for the illegal townhouses were damning enough, but Bea knew her son well. Gavin never did anything halfway when it came to his greed. If he was planning a construction project of this magnitude, he needed capital, and lots of it. Her eyes drifted to the heavy bottom drawer of the desk, the one that always stuck in the humidity. She crouched down, her knees popping in the quiet room, and tugged at the brass handle. With a groan of protesting wood, the drawer slid open, revealing a mess of cables and old gaming magazines. But buried beneath the clutter, tucked away like a shameful secret, was a sleek black folder embossed with the logo of the First National Bank. Bea pulled it out, her hands feeling the heavy weight of the high-quality paper. She opened the cover, and the numbers on the first page made her breath catch in her throat. It was a mortgage agreement. A secure loan approval for $500,000, $500,000 against the deed of the house. Her mind raced. How was this possible? Gavin had no job. He had no income verification. His credit score was abysmal, ruined by years of maxed-out credit cards and unpaid bills. No reputable bank would lend him $5, let alone $500,000. She flipped the page, her eyes scanning for the answer, and then she saw it. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold and dizzy. There, in the box marked co-signer, was the name Beatrice Washington. She stared at the bottom of the page where the signatures were required. Beside Gavin's aggressive scrawl was her name, but it was not her hand. It was a clumsy forgery, a childish imitation of the elegant cursive script she had practiced since grade school. The loops were too wide, the slant was wrong, and the ink pressure was heavy and hesitant. He had tried to mimic her signature, and he had failed miserably, but clearly it had been enough to fool a loan officer who didn't look too closely. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He had stolen her identity. He had used her perfect credit score, the financial reputation she and her husband had built over 40 years of hard work, and paid bills to secure a loan he had no intention of paying back. He was going to take the cash default on the payments and let the bank foreclose on the house, leaving her homeless and bankrupt in her old age. This was no longer just a family dispute. This was not just a son being disrespectful to his mother. This was bank fraud. This was identity theft involving a federally insured institution. This was a felony. Bea reached for her phone once more. She held the device over the document, ensuring the lighting was clear. She needed the focus to be sharp. She needed the judge to see every jagged line of that fake signature. Click. The image was captured. She stared at the screen for a moment, her hands shaking violently. But as she looked at the evidence of his betrayal, she realized something. She was not shaking from fear. The terror that had gripped her for months was gone. She was shaking with a pure volcanic rage. He had signed her name, but he had unknowingly signed his own arrest warrant. The shadows were beginning to lengthen across the yard, stretching out like long, dark fingers, trying to grasp the house as Bea slipped back into the garage. She closed the door silently behind her, locking the world out. The air inside was cooling slightly as the evening approached, but the smell of oil and dry heat still hung heavy. She moved to her makeshift bed and reached under the thin mattress, pulling out the final piece of her arsenal. It was not a weapon made of steel or lead, but a small, battered flip phone that she had kept charged for years strictly for emergencies. She flipped it open, the screen glowing with a faint blue light in the dim room. Her fingers, stiff from age but steady with purpose, dialed a number she had memorized long ago. It rang once, twice, then a deep, familiar voice answered. "City Planning Department, Dante speaking." Bea took a breath, letting the persona of the weak, confused old woman melt away. In its place returned the voice of Beatrice Washington, the woman who had helped build this community. "Hello, Dante," she said, her tone low and commanding. "I hope you are sitting down." There was a pause on the other end, followed by the rustle of a chair moving. "Mrs. Washington, is that you? It has been years. I haven't seen you since the funeral. Is everything all right?" "Everything is far from all right, Dante," she replied, cutting straight to the point. "Do you remember the lesson my husband taught you when you were just an intern? Do you remember what he said was the most expensive material in construction?" Dante answered without hesitation. "Integrity. He said concrete cracks and wood rots, but integrity holds forever." Bea nodded in the darkness. "Good. You remember. Because right now there is a man trying to bulldoze my home and destroy my husband's legacy using papers that have zero integrity. He has drafted plans for a townhouse complex inside the red conservation zone. He has violated 5 separate zoning codes. And worst of all, he has forged my signature on a federal mortgage application to fund it." She could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The sound of a pen scratching rapidly on paper followed. "Who is doing this?" "Mrs. Washington," Dante asked, his voice hardening into his official capacity. "Tell me, and I will shut them down immediately." "It is my son Gavin," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "But I do not want you to just shut him down remotely, Dante. I want you to come here. He is hosting a groundbreaking ceremony tomorrow morning for his investors. I want you to be the guest of honor." There was a grim silence on the line, a silent understanding passing between them. "I will be there, Mrs. Washington," Dante promised. "I will bring the full force of the department. We will make sure the law is upheld." Bea closed the phone with a satisfying snap. The screen went dark. She sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of the mining rig that had tormented her for so long. Tomorrow that noise would stop. Tomorrow the insults would stop. She lay back on her cot, staring up at the dusty rafters. A cold smile slowly spread across her face. It was not a smile of happiness. It was the smile of a general who knows the enemy is walking blindly into an ambush. The trap was set, and Gavin was already standing in the middle of it. The morning sun did not bring warmth to the damp garage, but it brought a cacophony of noise that shattered the peace of the dawn. Outside the thin metal walls, the world was being transformed into a stage set for Gavin's grand deception. Bea could hear the heavy thud of canvas tents being erected and the clinking of expensive glassware being stacked on tables. A string quartet was warming up, playing a cheerful melody that felt grotesquely out of place against the backdrop of betrayal. Gavin was sparing no expense to impress his victims. He was creating an illusion of old money and stability on a foundation of lies and fraud. Suddenly, the garage door groaned and slid up just enough for a figure to duck under. Gavin entered the dim space, bringing with him a burst of bright light and the scent of expensive cologne mixed with anxiety. He was dressed to kill in a sharp, tailored navy suit, his hair perfectly styled and a gold watch glinting on his wrist. He looked every inch the successful developer he pretended to be. He looked at his mother sitting on her cot, not with shame or pity, but with the critical annoyance of a director looking at a prop that didn't fit the scene. He held a bundle of coarse fabric in his hand and tossed it carelessly at her feet. The clothes landed in the dust with a soft, humiliating thud. "Put these on," he commanded, his voice tight with stress. "And do it now. The first investors will be arriving in 20 minutes. I cannot have you wandering around looking like a homeless person. It would ruin the aesthetic." Bea looked down at the pile. It was a pair of oversized, stained overalls and a ragged straw hat that looked like it had been chewed by a dog. It was a costume. He wanted to dress her up like a caricature of poverty. "If anyone sees you," he continued, his eyes narrowing, he leaned in close to ensure the threat landed. "If anyone asks, you are the gardener. You are the help. And most importantly, you are deaf. Do not open your mouth. Do not speak to my guests. Do not look them in the eye. Just rake the leaves in the back corner and stay invisible. If you say one word, I swear I will have you institutionalized by tonight." He did not wait for an answer. He turned on his heel and ducked back out into the sunlight. Bea heard the heavy rattle of a steel chain being threaded through the outer handles of the door. Then came the distinct click of a padlock snapping shut. He had chained her in from the outside, ensuring she could not escape to embarrass him. He treated her not like a mother, but like a dangerous animal that needed to be caged. Bea stood in the silence, the sound of the chain still echoing in her ears. She looked down at the filthy overalls at her feet. For a moment, the air in the garage felt heavier than ever, but then she lifted her head. She did not reach for the rags. She stepped forward and kicked the bundle of clothes hard, sending it skidding into the dark corner where the spiders spun their webs. She reached under her mattress and pulled out the dress she had been saving. It was wrinkled and smelled faintly of the garage, but it was a deep, elegant blue, the color she always wore to board meetings with her husband. She smoothed the fabric over her chest, standing tall in the gloom. Gavin thought he had locked away a deaf gardener. He was about to find out he had locked away the true owner of this estate, and she was done playing make-believe. The muffled sound of the string quartet drifting through the metal walls of the garage felt like a summons from another life. Outside, Gavin was playing the role of the benevolent tycoon. Inside the dim, dusty prison he had created, Bea was preparing to play a role of her own, but hers was not an act. She knelt on the concrete floor, ignoring the ache in her joints, and reached deep under the frame of the rusty metal bed. Her fingers brushed against the cool leather of a handle she had not touched in years. With a grunt of effort, she dragged the vintage suitcase out into the sliver of light cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the air as she unzipped the case. The smell that wafted up was not of oil and decay, but of lavender and old money. Inside, folded with meticulous care, lay her armor. It was not made of Kevlar or steel, but of the finest cream-colored wool. It was her Chanel suit. The very same suit she had worn 20 years ago, standing on the steps of City Hall as she was sworn in as the housing commissioner. Bea stripped off the house dress that smelled of sweat and sorrow. She stepped into the skirt, and it fit, as if time had not passed at all. She buttoned the jacket, feeling the structure of the garment straighten her spine. She was no longer the frail old woman shivering in the heat of a mining rig. She was Beatrice Washington, a woman who had commanded boardrooms and reshaped skylines. She reached into the side pocket of the case and pulled out a strand of genuine pearls. They were heavy and cool against her skin, a necklace her husband had gifted her for their 30th anniversary. Finally, she found the small gold tube at the bottom of the bag. She uncapped it, revealing a stick of lipstick in a shade called Victory Red. Using the reflection in the side of a polished chrome car bumper, she applied the color. Her lips, which had trembled with fear only yesterday, now set into a firm crimson line of determination. The transformation was complete. The gardener was gone. The commissioner had returned. She turned her attention to the back door of the garage. Gavin had chained the front, knowing she was too weak to force it. But he had forgotten about the heavy-duty tools his father had left on the workbench. Bea walked over to the pegboard and took down the massive pair of red-handled bolt cutters. They were heavy, weighing nearly 10 pounds, but she lifted them with a strength fueled by pure adrenaline. She marched to the side service door, which was secured by a rusted chain Gavin had likely found in a junk pile. She positioned the jaws of the cutter around the weakest link. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the scent of grease and lavender. She squeezed the handles. Her muscles strained and her arms shook, but she did not let go. She channeled every insult, every cold meal, every moment of disrespect into her grip. With a sharp, violent crack that sounded like a gunshot, the metal link snapped in two. The chain fell to the floor with a heavy clatter. Bea pushed the door open, and the bright sunlight flooded in, blinding her for a moment. She stepped out into the fresh air, leaving the darkness behind her forever. The war had begun. The garden party was in full swing, a perfectly orchestrated symphony of wealth and pretension. White linen tablecloths fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the air was filled with the polite murmur of conversation and the clinking of crystal flutes. At the center of it all, standing on a raised wooden platform near the old oak tree, was Gavin. He held a glass of expensive champagne aloft, the golden liquid catching the sunlight. He was beaming, feeding off the admiration of the wealthy investors gathered around him. He looked like a king surveying his new kingdom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming with practiced charisma. "Thank you for joining me on this historic day. What you see around you is not just land, it is potential. It is the future. My $1 million vision is to transform this outdated relic into a modern sanctuary of luxury living. We are not just building townhouses, we are building a legacy." The crowd applauded politely, mesmerized by his confidence. Gavin took a sip of his wine, basking in the glow of his own deception. He opened his mouth to continue to spin more lies about the zoning permits he didn't have, but the words died in his throat. His eyes, drawn by a sudden movement near the back of the property, widened in disbelief. From behind the shadows of the detached garage, a figure emerged. It was not the hunched figure of a deaf gardener in rags. It was a vision that seemed to step straight out of a high society magazine from a bygone era. Beatrice Washington walked onto the lawn. The midday sun hit her, instantly illuminating the pristine cream wool of her vintage Chanel suit. It glowed with an almost ethereal brightness against the dark green of the overgrown grass. Her silver hair, usually unkempt, was swept back in a dignified wave, and the strand of pearls around her neck caught the light with a soft luster. She did not walk with the shuffle of an invalid. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her chin held high, her posture radiating an authority that commanded instant attention. One by one, the heads of the guests turned. The applause died down. The chatter faded into a confused and stunned silence. They looked from the slick young man on the stage to the regal woman approaching him. They saw the resemblance, but more importantly, they saw the power. She looked like the true owner of the estate, returning from a long exile. She said nothing yet. Her presence screamed louder than any microphone. Gavin felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The blood drained from his face, leaving him ghostly pale beneath his tan. His hand began to tremble uncontrollably. The crystal flute slipped from his sweating fingers. It hit the wooden platform with a sharp, shattering crash that echoed like a thunderclap in the silent garden. Champagne splashed onto his polished Italian shoes, but he didn't even notice. He stared at her as if he were seeing a ghost. This wasn't the broken woman he had locked away. This was the woman who used to terrify board members with a single glance. Panic clawed at his throat. He leaned down toward Nia, who was standing frozen beside the stage, her mouth slightly open. "Get her out of here," he hissed through clenched teeth, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. "Get the security. Tell them she is the senile aunt. Tell them she is crazy. Just drag that old woman back inside before she ruins everything." Nia signaled frantically to the 2 hired security guards standing at the edge of the patio. They were large men in tight black T-shirts, hired to keep the riffraff out, and they moved to intercept the older woman approaching the stage. They stepped into her path, crossing their arms in a display of intimidation that usually worked on paparazzi and angry neighbors. But they had never faced a woman like Beatrice Washington. Bea did not slow her pace. She did not flinch. She simply lifted her chin and locked eyes with the larger of the 2 men. It was a look of such concentrated, icy authority that it stopped him cold. It was the look she had used to silence rowdy town hall meetings and rebellious teenagers alike. "Do not even think about it," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Step aside." The guard blinked. Instinct took over. He recognized the tone of someone who was not to be touched. He uncrossed his arms and stepped back, mumbling a confused apology. The path to the stage was clear. Gavin watched in horror as his mother ascended the wooden stairs. The click of her heels on the timber sounded like the ticking of a bomb. He stood frozen, the microphone clutched in his sweaty hand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He wanted to push her away. He wanted to scream, but his body refused to obey. He was paralyzed by the sheer audacity of her presence. Bea reached out. She did not struggle. She simply wrapped her hand around the microphone and pulled. Gavin's grip was weak, and the device slid easily into her possession. A high-pitched squeal of feedback cut through the air, causing the guests to cover their ears. Then silence fell. Bea turned to face the crowd. She looked at the faces of the bankers, the developers, and the wealthy socialites. She did not look crazy. She looked magnificent. "Good morning, everyone," she began, her voice booming through the speakers, steady and clear. "My name is Beatrice Washington, and I believe there has been a terrible misunderstanding." A murmur went through the crowd. People exchanged glances. The name Washington carried weight in this city, a weight that Gavin's generic sales pitch lacked. "You have been invited here today to invest in a vision." Bea continued, pacing slowly across the stage. "You have been told that this land is a blank canvas, ready to be painted over with concrete and glass. But you are standing on history. My grandfather bought this land in 1922. He planted that oak tree you see behind you with his own hands to mark the birth of my father. This soil is not just dirt, it is a legacy. And the man standing behind me, claiming to be the owner, is nothing more than a squatter with a printer and a very vivid imagination." She gestured to Gavin, who was now shrinking back against the railing, looking for a place to hide. The investors turned to look at him, their expressions shifting from admiration to suspicion. "This man is not a developer," Bea said, her voice sharpening. "He is a fraud. He has told you he has permits. He does not. He has told you the zoning is approved. It is not. He has told you he owns the deed. He most certainly does not. I am the sole owner of this estate, and as long as there is breath in my body, not a single brick of his ridiculous townhouse project will ever be laid on this grass." She spoke with such detailed knowledge, citing the exact year of the original survey and the specific geological composition of the riverbed, that the crowd was mesmerized. They were business people, and they recognized competence when they saw it. They also recognized a lie when it was being dismantled in front of them. Gavin stood there pale and trembling, realizing that his mother wasn't just ruining his party, she was systematically dismantling his entire life. The paralysis that had gripped Gavin finally broke. Seeing his investors nodding along with his mother's words triggered a primal panic in his chest. He lunged forward, his face twisted in an ugly snarl, his hands clawing for the microphone. "Give that back!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You are ruining everything!" Bea did not flinch. She pivoted on her heel, dodging his grasping hands with the agility of a woman half her age. With her free hand, she reached into the inside pocket of her cream jacket and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. She held them up high so everyone could see the official city seal stamped in red ink on the front page. "Do not listen to his excuses," she declared, her voice cutting through the humid air like a blade. "Look at the facts. This document is the official city zoning map for the year 2024. She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. "Gavin here has sold you a dream of 3-story luxury townhouses with roof decks and underground parking. But according to this map, which is public record, this entire estate is designated as R1 conservation land. That means no subdivisions, no multi-unit structures, and certainly no commercial development." Gavin froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sick and gray. "He is not selling you a development opportunity," Bea continued, her voice rising with righteous anger. "He is selling you air. He is selling you a lawsuit waiting to happen. If you sign those checks today, you are buying nothing but a federal investigation." With a dramatic flick of her wrist, she tossed the papers off the stage. They fluttered down like white birds, landing on the perfectly set tables in front of the front row guests. A heavy-set man in a gray suit, the lead investor, picked up a page. He adjusted his glasses and squinted at the map. "She is right," the man rumbled, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It says right here, protected heritage site. We can't build a doghouse on this land, let alone a complex." The atmosphere shifted instantly. The polite smiles vanished, replaced by cold, hard glares. The guests began to murmur, turning to one another with looks of disbelief and anger. They turned their eyes toward Gavin, demanding answers. "No! No! Wait!" Gavin stammered, backing away until he hit the railing. "She is lying. She printed those off the internet. Look at her. She is old. She is confused. She has dementia. She doesn't know what day it is." "Do not listen to a crazy old woman." He pointed a shaking finger at his mother, desperation leaking from every pore. But the crowd was not looking at him. They were looking at the official stamp on the paper, and then back at the woman standing tall in her Chanel suit, who looked anything but confused. The cracks in his facade were turning into craters, and the whole world was watching him fall apart. The murmurs of the crowd were getting louder, a storm of questions brewing in the garden, but Bea was not finished. She did not let Gavin catch his breath or spin another lie. She reached into her pocket one last time and pulled out the black folder, the one she had retrieved from the bottom drawer of the chaotic desk. She held it up high in the sunlight, like a judge holding a gavel, and the paper rattled in the breeze. "If you think the zoning lies are bad," she announced, her voice steady and cold, "listen to this. In my hand is a mortgage agreement for $500,000, a loan taken out against the very house you are standing in front of, and at the bottom is my name, Beatrice Washington." She paused, letting the investors lean in closer. "But I did not sign this. My son forged my signature because his own credit is worthless. He stole my identity to secure funds from a federally insured bank. That is not just a lie, gentlemen. That is a felony. And do you want to know where that $500,000 actually went? It did not go to architects. It did not go to permits, and it certainly did not go to improving this property." She pointed a sharp, accusing finger at the detached garage behind her, the metal structure that had been her prison. "It went in there. While I was sweating in the heat and eating scraps, he used stolen money to buy a massive server farm to mine digital currency. He is not a developer. He is a gambler playing with stolen chips. The only thing he has built is a fire hazard that is racking up an electric bill he cannot pay." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The image of the sophisticated businessman shattered completely, leaving only a desperate criminal in its place. The lead investor shook his head in disgust and turned to walk away, signaling to his entourage to follow. The dream was dead. Near the steps, Naya let out a sharp, high-pitched cry. She covered her ears with her hands, shaking her head violently as if trying to block out the truth. She knew what this meant. The cars, the dinners, the promise of a life of leisure, it was all dissolving into smoke. "You liar!" she screamed at Gavin, tears streaming down her face. "You told me you owned it all." Gavin looked at the document in his mother's hand and then at the backs of the retreating investors. His world was collapsing in real time. The veins in his neck bulged and his face turned a deep crimson violet. The humiliation was too much to bear. The facade of the charming son evaporated instantly, replaced by the monster Bea had seen that night in the smoke. "Shut up!" he screamed, a sound that was more animal than human. "Shut your mouth, you old witch!" He did not care about the witnesses anymore. He did not care about the law. He launched himself across the wooden stage, his hands reaching out to choke the truth right out of her throat. He wanted to hurt her. He wanted to silence her permanently. Bea stood her ground, bracing herself for the blow, closing her eyes as his shadow fell over her. But just as his fingers curled into claws ready to strike, a siren wailed from the driveway, cutting through the chaos like a knife. The sharp wail of the siren did not just cut through the air, it physically shoved the violence aside. Gavin's hand, which had been inches from his mother's throat, froze in midair. His fingers twitched with unspent rage, but the sound of approaching authority paralyzed him. Before he could lower his arm or compose a lie, the source of the noise burst through the front gates. 3 massive black SUVs bearing the official seal of the City Inspection Task Force roared up the long driveway. They did not stop at the pavement. With a reckless disregard that matched the urgency of the moment, they swerved off the asphalt and drove directly onto the lawn. The tires tore through the perfectly manicured grass, leaving deep, ugly ruts in the earth and crushing the white hydrangeas Gavin had planted just yesterday to impress his victims. The vehicles skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust and exhaust, surrounding the wooden stage like a pack of wolves cornering their prey. The doors flew open in perfect synchronization. Officers in tactical vests poured out their hands, resting on their holsters. But the man who commanded the scene stepped out of the lead vehicle with a slower, more deliberate weight. It was Dante. He was not wearing a suit. He was wearing a dark blue windbreaker emblazoned with the bright yellow badge of the chief building inspector. His face was set in a grim line of stone, a look of absolute professional fury. He walked past the stunned investors who parted like the Red Sea. He marched up the wooden steps, his heavy boots thudding with the rhythm of justice. He did not look at Bea. His eyes were locked entirely on Gavin. Gavin stumbled back, his chest heaving. "Who are you?" he stammered, trying to regain a shred of his former arrogance. "You cannot park on the grass. This is private property. Get off my stage." Dante did not speak. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a bright neon red sticker. It was a stop work order, a red tag usually reserved for the most dangerous and illegal construction sites. In a movement that was swift and humiliating, Dante slapped the adhesive square directly onto the lapel of Gavin's expensive navy suit. The sound of the slap echoed louder than the sirens. Gavin Miller. Dante said, his voice deep and resonating with the authority of the entire city. "By the power vested in the Department of Planning and Zoning, I am shutting you down. You are in violation of federal land use laws, fraud, and endangerment. This project is dead, and so is your freedom." That was the signal. 2 officers rushed up the stairs behind Dante. Gavin tried to run. He scrambled toward the railing, thrashing and kicking like a wild animal caught in a snare. "No, let go of me," he shrieked, his voice cracking into a sob. "I own this. I am the owner." The officers grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back with practiced efficiency. The metallic click of the handcuffs snapping shut was the final note in the symphony of his destruction. They hauled him up, forcing him to look out at the crowd of investors he had tried to swindle. He was not a king anymore. He was just a criminal with a sticker on his chest and nowhere left to run. The officer standing next to Dante did not shout. He did not need to raise his voice because the gravity of his words was heavy enough to silence the entire garden. He held up a folded warrant and began to read the charges aloud, making sure every syllable was heard by the gathered crowd. The list was long and ugly. Count 1 wire fraud involving a financial institution. Count 2 forgery of legal documents. Count 3 aggravated identity theft. But the final charge made the crowd gasp in collective horror. Count 4 custodial interference and criminal abuse of an elderly dependent. The words hung in the humid air, painting a picture of a monster rather than a businessman. Gavin twisted in the grip of the officers, his face slick with sweat and tears. He looked around wildly, his eyes darting back and forth, seeking an escape or a scapegoat. He realized there was no way out. The evidence was irrefutable, and the witnesses were powerful. In a final act of desperate self-preservation, his gaze landed on Naya. She was standing near the overturned champagne tower, her hands trembling over her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. A look of pure malice crossed Gavin's face. He stopped struggling for a moment and lunged his head toward her. It was her idea, he screamed, his voice shrill and breaking. "She is the one who wanted the house. She told me to lock the old woman up. She said my mother was a burden and we needed the space. I did not want to do it. She made me. Arrest her. She is the mastermind behind all of this." The accusation hit Nia like a physical slap. She staggered back, her expensive heels sinking into the soft mud of the lawn. She looked at the man she had conspired with, the man she thought loved her, and saw nothing but a coward willing to sacrifice anyone to save his own skin. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to scream that he was lying, but no words came out, only a ragged, choked sob. She collapsed onto one of the white folding chairs, burying her face in her manicured hands as the weight of their crimes crushed her. The investors who had been silent witnesses just moments ago now became the jury. Smartphones were raised in the air, recording every second of the pathetic breakdown. The lead investor stepped forward, his face purple with rage. "You can blame whoever you want, son," he growled, pointing a thick finger at Gavin. "But my lawyers will be contacting you in jail. We will sue you for every dime you have ever stolen, and we will make sure you never do business in this state again." The officers had heard enough. They tightened their grip and hauled Gavin down the stairs. He dragged his feet, kicking up dust, pleading with anyone who would listen, but his cries fell on deaf ears. They shoved him into the back of the patrol car, forcing his head down to avoid the frame. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside a cage much smaller than the one he had forced his mother to live in. As the engine roared to life and the vehicle began to roll down the long driveway, the party was officially over. Bea stood amidst the wreckage, the overturned tables, and the spilled wine, looking at the flashing blue lights fading into the distance. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the feeling of justice finally being served. The police cruisers had long since disappeared around the bend, leaving behind only the heavy smell of exhaust and the wreckage of a party that never really began. The investors had fled in their luxury sedans, eager to distance themselves from the scandal before the news crews arrived. The garden was quiet now, save for the rustling of the wind in the old oak tree, the very tree Bea's father had planted. Amidst the overturned chairs and the trampled hydrangeas, only two figures remained. Bea stood tall in her cream suit, a statue of resilience. Nia, crumpled on the grass at her feet, was a portrait of defeat. Nia crawled forward, her knees staining green on the ruined lawn. She reached out to grab the hem of Bea's skirt, her mascara running in dark streaks down her face. "Mom, please!" she sobbed, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and calculation. "Please, you have to believe me. It was all him. I was scared of him. I wanted to help you, but he wouldn't let me. I am your daughter. Do not let them take me too. Do not throw me out on the street." Bea took a slow, deliberate step back, pulling her skirt out of Nia's grasping reach. She looked down at the younger woman. Her eyes were dry. The well of blind maternal affection that had allowed them to walk all over her for years had finally run dry, leaving only clarity behind. "Stop crying," Nia Bea said, her voice calm but harder than granite. "Do not insult my intelligence with your tears." "But I didn't do anything," Nia wailed, looking up with wide, pleading eyes. "I was a victim too." "That is exactly the problem," Bea countered, cutting her off. "You did nothing. You watched your husband lock your mother in a garage and you did nothing. You watched me shivering in the winter cold and you did nothing." Bea's voice dropped lower, trembling with the memory of the humiliation. "Actually, that is a lie. You did do something. When I begged for a bathroom because I was locked in, you were the one who handed me a plastic bucket and told me to be quiet. When I asked for a blanket, you were the one who threw me the rug from the dog's bed. You were not a hostage, Nia. You were an accomplice. You enjoyed the dinners and the clothes and the cars bought with the money stolen from my name. You were happy to live like a queen as long as I was hidden away like a rat." Nia fell silent, her excuses dying in her throat under the weight of the truth. She looked up and saw no forgiveness in her mother's eyes, only a mirror reflecting her own cruelty. "Stand up," Bea commanded. Nia scrambled to her feet, wiping her nose, looking small and fragile without Gavin to hide behind. "You are not going to jail today," Bea said, looking toward the empty house. "But you are not staying here. This house is for family, and right now I do not recognize you. I want you to pack your bags. Not the designer clothes you bought with my credit cards, just what you owned before you met Gavin." "But where will I go?" Nia whispered. "I have no money. I have nowhere." "Then you will learn," Bea said, turning her back on her. "You will learn what it means to survive. You will get a job. You will work with your hands. You will learn the value of a dollar that you actually earned. And maybe one day when you can stand on your own 2 feet without stepping on someone else's neck, you can come back and knock on my door. But until then, get out of my sight." Bea walked toward the porch, leaving Nia alone in the driveway. Moments later, the sound of a suitcase rolling over gravel marked the end of an era. The leech was gone, and for the first time in years, the house could finally breathe again. The seasons had turned, and with them the fortunes of the Washington estate had shifted like the tide. It had been 3 months since the sirens wailed in the driveway, and the yellow bulldozer had been towed away in disgrace. The air around the house was no longer filled with the aggressive roar of engines or the suffocating heat of mining rigs. Instead, the morning breeze carried the sweet scent of blooming flowers and the gentle chirping of cardinals nesting in the great oak tree. Bea sat on the newly repainted front porch, rocking slowly in her favorite wicker chair. The wood beneath her feet was solid and clean, no longer covered in the mud of a construction site. In her hand, she held a delicate porcelain teacup, the steam rising in curling ribbons against the sunlight. It was a moment of perfect peace, a silence she had fought a war to earn. The legal battle had been swift and decisive. The courts had looked at the evidence, the forged signatures, and the predatory loans, and they had acted with the fury of the law. The deed to the house was back in her name, safe and secure. The fraudulent mortgage had been voided, and the bank was currently pursuing Gavin for the damages. As for the debts he had racked up, Bea had found a poetic solution. She had sold his flashy sports car, the one he used to drive away from her while she was hungry, and she had used every penny of the proceeds to restore the property. She looked out at the garden where the grass was green and lush once more. The money from the car had paid for the landscaping and specifically for the restoration of the heritage rose garden. It was a beautiful irony that his vanity vehicle had paid to rebuild the very legacy he tried to destroy. A car pulled into the driveway, but this time Bea did not flinch. It was a modest city sedan. Dante stepped out holding a folder of finalized permits and a box of pastries. He walked up the steps not as an inspector but as a friend. He sat in the chair beside her, and for an hour they just talked. They laughed about the old days and shared stories about her husband. Dante treated her with the reverence and respect of a son, the kind of son she had always wished for. He told her that the city had officially designated the estate as a permanent historic landmark, ensuring that no one could ever try to pave over it again. As Dante left, waving goodbye from the gate, Bea stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. She smoothed the fabric of her dress and looked out over the neighborhood she had helped design decades ago. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of victory. Then she looked forward, her gaze piercing and direct, as if looking right into the soul of anyone who dared to underestimate her. They looked at me and saw a fragile old woman. They thought I was past my prime, just a relic to be pushed aside and forgotten. They thought they could bury me in the dark and steal what was mine. But they made a fatal mistake. They forgot who I am. They forgot that the concrete and steel that holds this city together has my signature on the foundation. I did not just live in this town, I built it. And you should never, ever play games with the woman who laid the cornerstones of your world. This story serves as a powerful reminder that we should never mistake silence for weakness or age for incompetence. Gavin and Naya saw Bea merely as an obstacle, a relic of the past to be discarded, failing to realize that her years of experience were actually a fortress of knowledge. They built their plans on a foundation of lies, greed, and superficiality, while Bea stood on the solid ground of integrity and hard-earned respect. The true lesson here is that legacy is not just about the property or money you inherit. It is about the character you build. When you strip away the titles and the assets, what remains is who you are. Intelligence and dignity are weapons that do not rust with time and justice, though sometimes slow, eventually finds those who think they are above the law. It teaches us to respect those who paved the way before us, for they often hold the keys to the very structures we stand upon. If you felt the satisfaction of seeing the tables turn and justice finally served, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Join our community for more stories where the underdog bites back and the truth always wins.